Welcome to the fourth installment in this series of interviews where we explore what it is like to be a fiction writer in the age of the global culture wars. Earlier, we've been talking to Bret Easton Ellis, Janine Cummins, and Kylie Reid. This time, our guest is Hari Kunzru, who began his career as a writer in Britain, as a journalist and travel writer, before he debuted as a novelist in 2002 with the novel The Impressionist. The topics and themes of his novels include themes like neocolonialism, cultural appropriation, globalization, racism, right-wing populism, online culture, white supremacy, and political radicalism, which should be enough to tell you that he is not the kind of novelist who prefers to withdraw to his ivory tower. In all of his work, he engages with the ideas and the debates and the anxieties of our times. Hari, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
First of all, looking back on your career, can you describe for us the move you made from being a journalist and a travel correspondent and TV presenter to becoming a novelist?
Yeah, I mean, the secret was that I was always trying to be a novelist and nobody was interested. I mean, the first novel that I wrote when I was 21. I was very under the influence of American sort of postmodernist writers like Thomas Pynchon, and I wrote a very messy metafictional novel that I made some attempts to get published, and I think a couple of agents at least took a meeting with me, but I sort of went through my 20s exploring different kinds of area. I was a philosophy graduate student for a while, and eventually what happened was that really my only marketable skill was that I knew about the internet. And this is in the sort of early mid 90s, at a time when not so many people did know what the internet was. I was very excited by it, and so I drifted into this kind of scene around, I suppose, the cultural impact of technology. You know, I was never the person that you would hire to describe the new Intel chip or something like that, but I was always particularly fascinated by how this new technology was changing the world, and so I ended up working for a magazine called Wired, an American technology magazine based in San Francisco, and that gave me a kind of I suppose a viewpoint on the like the 90s into the early 2000s, the kind of boom in internet culture.
I see. So I've been kind of interested in what in film industry is called the whole equation, which is kind of the whole process involved in getting a book out. So what happened? What made it
Well,
possible for you?
I mean, it was a very gradual process. I mean, I have graduate students now at New York University who are all very keen to be published immediately, and hope against hope that their first effort is going to be the one that gets them the big book deal. But for me, you know, it was a process of really learning my craft by doing all kinds of different writing. I mean, I did this journalistic writing where you learn about deadlines and word counts and various kinds of formats, really, like what you can actually do in 400 words or 1,500 words or 3,000 words. And also I had to make connections. I had to be visible as somebody who was publishing writing and who might be you know, a plausible person to take on as a client of a literary agency. And what happened for me was that you know, I got a short story published in an anthology, a sort of open submission anthology, which is the sort of thing that wasn't really read by ordinary people, but industry people would look for new talent. This is kind of a little bit before everything was online, so it was still a kind of hard copy publishing culture in the late 90s. And an agent saw this, I had a meeting. He said, "Are you working on a novel?" And I described the book that I was trying to write at that time, and he took me on as a client, and that was very psychologically important for me. For a long time I'd been working in isolation and wasn't really sure whether I was, maybe I was fooling myself that this was something I could do, and so that gave me a sort of impetus to carry on working on this book, and eventually I finished it, and he orchestrated a kind of auction between different publishing houses. I had been very poor for a long time. I'd been, how it is being a freelance writer. You're not rolling in money, and then suddenly there were various publishers in Britain and America and internationally bidding for this manuscript, and it was, it's a cliche to say such and such a thing is life changing, but it really was. It was a kind of total transformation for me, and then I was able after that to concentrate on writing fiction, and without having to be spending most of my time doing other things for money. So that was, I went into my 30s in a position to really concentrate on my fiction work.
So you never doubted that you were a fiction writer, that you were going to write many books after the first one. It's not so easy to write a novel.
There was a second bad novel as well, which was bad in a different way. And the second novel was a kind of interesting lesson for me as well, in that I'd been disappointed by the failure of the world to recognize my strange metafictional novel, and some young literary agent or publisher, I forget, said, well, you need to write something very realist and modest, and just start out being less ambitious, and so I thought, okay, I will try a realist story, and I hated writing this thing. I hated every minute of writing this book, and I gritted my teeth and I finished it, and then I showed it to one person who said that they thought it was the most depressing thing they'd ever read in their lives. And I agreed. Really, I had no idea why anyone would want to read it, and so I thought I basically had made a pact with myself that if I didn't, if the third one didn't happen, then I was going to do something else. I thought I might try and be a foreign correspondent.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so I really respect how you finished a novel that you hated writing. That must be very hard.
I think that's sort of the lesson. That's really what separates working writers from hobbyist writers.
Yeah,
I think there are days when you sit down and you don't feel inspired and you're not sure about your project, but you have to move forward because otherwise, there's this element of sunk costs, as any economist will know. And I think subsequently I have started things and abandoned them. I had to say, I've had a sense that they just weren't working, but there is, I think, something about being able to bring projects to a conclusion even when you don't have an external deadline or no one's waiting for your book. You just have to do that for yourself, and I think that's an important discipline for a fiction writer, because it takes a long time. Writing a novel is a project 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. So you had success, and you got this John Llewellyn Rhys Prize, or you were awarded that prize, and you turned it down. Can you explain your reasons for that?
It was to do with the sponsor of the prize. If people in the audience are familiar with the British newspaper media, the sponsor was a newspaper called the Mail on Sunday, which is part of the Daily Mail group. And throughout my childhood and youth, this paper had been a kind of a sort of nationalist voice, I suppose. It was it had always spoken out against immigration. It had made, I think it was part of the atmosphere of creating an atmosphere in Britain that was very uncomfortable for me growing up. The idea of shaking the hand of the editor of that newspaper was repugnant to me, and it was a very easy decision.
So can you explain the impact of that kind of paper on your youth and people that you knew in your youth?
Yeah, I mean, well, I grew up. I mean, my sort of adolescence was in the 1980s, and it was a time when there was a very significant far right presence in Britain, and I lived in a sort of where the East End of London shades out into the county of Essex. It's a very white area. It was a very I mean, it was a very right wing area. It was a kind of the shock troops of Thatcherism, I suppose, came from this Essex culture, and the Daily Mail presented itself as the voice of this sort of populist, conservative point of view. They didn't like gay people, they didn't like immigrants, they didn't like basically. I mean, there was no I was made to feel that ideally I wouldn't exist. I mean, I'm very British. I have an Indian father and an English mother, and so it's very disorientating as a young person to be told that in some way you're inadequately what you feel yourself to be.
Yeah.
It's a and I think that paper and other papers and other parts of the media were responsible for a great deal of sort of violence being perpetrated sort of on the streets directly. I mean, I had a few experiences like that myself, but it just felt like to suddenly kind of walk into a hotel ballroom and pretend that we were all part of this wonderful
Yeah.
cultural
Yeah.
thing. Because, I mean, the point of a newspaper sponsoring a book prize is to have the cultural credibility of literature or art
Yeah.
uh, attached to your product, and I didn't want to give my credibility to that. I mean, I didn't think it was going to be a big deal. It was not, but it became a drama really, and the newspaper uh, came after me afterwards. They For a few years they tried all sorts of ways to discredit me, and I mean, at one point that I got phoned up by a Daily Mail journalist who said, "We need to confront you about your drug use," and I was like, what are you talking about? What information do you have? And it was an interview that I'd given to a kind of comic. There was a guy who had a column on El País, the Spanish
Yeah.
newspaper, and he was very sort of flamboyant, like a joker. And we'd been joking around. He said, "Are you very English? Do you drink tea at 5?" And I said, "Well, I use different stimulants at different times of the day," and I made up some sort of list. I do a line of coke in the morning, and I this and that and the other. So this went into the paper, and hilariously, they attempted to leverage this as a kind of admission that I was some sort of fiend.
Yeah.
Um, but this, I mean, that went on for years and years. Really, I think they've forgotten about me these days. They have other things on their mind. But I mean, I felt thoroughly justified in not participating in their little cultural moment.
So it was a successful political act on your part, in a way.
Well, I mean, if you look at it
Yeah.
cynically, yes. I mean, it positioned me as somebody with a particular kind of politics in it, and it made me visible in a certain way. But I mean, it genuinely wasn't meant in a cynical way. It was a very sort of heartfelt thing. I just didn't want to be there with those people.
I wasn't suggesting cynical. I said a successful political act, which is, yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
a
I mean,
sincere
I think
thing to do.
it also showed me that how little sort of activism there really was in the British book world at that time. I mean, when people were writing about it, the comparison they reached for was John Berger giving his Booker Prize money to the Black Panthers, and that happened in
Yeah.
1972. So I mean, between 1972 and
Yeah.
was there really nothing that no one had made any kind of oppositional political gesture? But maybe not.
But you do write about being difficult in Red Pill, to which we will return later, where the narrator there enjoys being difficult.
He's more difficult than me,
Yeah.
actually. I get to sort of like, you know, enact some of my fantasies of
Yeah,
being less
exactly.
polite than I am.
Yeah. Um, let's turn to your book White Tears. Um, this is where you explore the theme of cultural appropriation or fetishization of black culture by white, I guess, college kids at the beginning at least. They call themselves audio craftsmen, and they try to take old black music and turn it into, or they kind of steal sounds from old black music, and they use it in all sorts of fashion in order to create, I guess, new sounds for modern bands and
Mm.
so forth. Um, so, to what extent would you say that that novel is intended as a critique of, I guess, toxic whiteness in American culture?
I mean, yeah. I mean, the idea of a critique is something that I always I get a little nervous around framing a piece of fiction in that way, because I think the good good fiction in a way stages complexity, or stages situations where difficult things or contradictions come up against
Yeah,
each other, rather than, you know, I mean, rather than making an argument or kind of pushing a particular point of view. Obviously I do have a point of view, but my interest was with that was actually kind of going back to my own like childhood and teenage years. You know, I talked about growing up in Essex with its very white culture, but it also, this was a culture which had a great love of Black American music. It was a strange paradox. Some of the most racist people you would ever meet were listening to funk and soul
yeah,
music, and so we had this Black culture without Black people, and and as I went on into colleges, you know, I came across all sorts of different scenes. I remember there was a sort of weird white reggae kind of thing that was going on at where I was at university, and I got very fascinated. I've always been fascinated by the idea of authenticity
yeah,
and the meanings that the authenticity gives to people. But it seemed to me that one of the things that white suburban kids yearn for is to feel like their lives are authentic in some way, and they see that especially with the kind of black popular music that comes out of a kind of hard working class urban experience. You know, hip hop now. You know, earlier on, these kind of you know, 70s soul music or whatever, and the kind of the idea of sort of almost buying authenticity or cloaking yourself in a kind of cultural authenticity seemed fascinating to me, and it seems to be one of the kind of complexities of the relationship between white audiences and black music. You know, um, and there's a very interesting sort of slide from loving something. I mean, I love music of all kinds, and you know, and have a very sort of deep love of a lot of different kinds of Black American music. But there's a slide between loving something and trying to and appropriating it, we would call it now, of trying to own it or trying to profit from it in some way.
yeah,
And I decided to tell the story of these young record producers who are kind of you know, they're authenticity fetishists. They use old analog equipment. You know, they feel like they're kind of in some way almost realer than the people you know, who made the music almost, and it turns into a kind of ghost story. They fake a 1920s blues record, and as you know, the blues has this strange kind of significance these days as a kind of sign of authenticity. Like, you know, if there's a beer advert or a whiskey advert that wants to talk about the bourbon or something that wants to talk about the American South, they'll have a bluesman on a porch playing playing guitar. So they kind of they try and own this hyper authentic or this fake authentic music, and then something comes out of the past towards them. It becomes they become haunted by the kind of aspect of that culture that's been sort of suppressed.
So in a way, you use that, I guess, quite general white anxiety towards this whole notion of cultural appropriation, because I guess what a lot of your readers, I guess, would be white liberals, and they would be, you know, they kind of fear that they are guilty and that someday people will come for you, and that you use that in order to create this feeling
But they
of
are
dread.
actually coming for you.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, the idea of guilt is really fascinating to me because, as you say, there's a certain sort of liberal politics that roots itself through guilt and innocence, and
Yeah.
you know, people sort of, people's secret aim is to not feel guilty and to feel that in some way they, you know, it's not their fault, and they'll perform all sorts of contortions trying to make themselves feel less guilty, and you know, the truth of it is, of course, that the personal guilt and innocence is not what this is about. It's about, you know, it's about structural changes. It's about people having access to sort of resources and opportunities that were denied them. It's very material. I mean, you know, I mean, I think you can kind of sidestep all this terrible hand-wringing liberal politics by focusing on these very practical, material questions, you know, about resources.
Yeah.
And you know, and obviously in the music industry there's a long history of black musicians being ripped off by record labels and producers and so on. So music seemed to me a wonderful milieu to set this kind of story in, to kind of really, I mean, I think of it as kind of putting my fingers into the wound, or onto the sore spot of this culture. And it was an interesting project to try and do, because I don't think it's a project that it would be so easy for somebody who was American to do. I mean, I have, you know, from my own life, I have a kind of I have a kind of experience with these kind of questions, but I'm also an outsider.
Yeah.
And I'm doing this thing of going where I'm not invited in a certain way. There's a kind of, I'm placing myself in the middle of this cultural conversation that's kind of not mine.
Yeah.
But I can use that outsider's perspective, but also I won't automatically get read as belonging to one side or another. I mean, when I travel in the US, it's often very interesting having, I mean, people can probably tell I have an English accent rather than an American accent, and I scan visually in a kind of ambiguous way.
Yeah.
And that often means that I can go into situations and people aren't quite certain of, you know, how they should read me, and that can sometimes be very bad, but it can sometimes be very good. I can get into conversations and be present in places where it might be harder if I was easily identifiable in terms of, oh, you're, you know, from this class, this place, this, you know, this background.
So so this allows you to put your finger in the sore spot of the culture as a writer, which indeed you're doing also in your latest novel, Red Pill, which takes on the theme of right-wing populism, and also that kind of nihilistic and very shrewd way of being a right-wing populist online, and the kind of anxiety that creates. The title, of course, Red Pill, is an allusion to the movie Matrix, right? So the narrator is confronted with a choice. You can take the blue pill and continue to live happily in your illusion, or you can take the red pill and you can see the world for what it is. And he discovers that the world is about to, I guess, if not explode, at least to become very threatening to the likes of him. So can you talk a little bit of the background? It's set in Germany in the beginning. What were your ideas?
So, I mean, you know, as I've said, I've spent far too much time on the internet, in my life, and I've been on the internet now, I think probably for more of my life than not, which is a kind of interesting milestone to think about. But I've always kind of spent time lurking on far right forums. I've been, it's part of my project, I suppose, is to try and understand that way of thinking and that kind of politics. And this idea of the red pill began to kind of percolate through the right wing internet maybe a decade or so ago, and it was this idea that the idea is that there's a kind of culturally dominant narrative that's lazily accepted by elite liberals, and that's what you would think of as the sort of the blue pill
Yeah.
version of how
Yeah.
things are, and that they as people on the far right, with a particularly, I mean, usually with a kind of biological racism and a kind of distrust of democracy, and a wish for authoritarian rule and return to kind of sort of essentialist ideas about gender and so on, that their version of things is the red pill. When they convert somebody, and there are people who are actively trying to recruit younger dwellers on the internet, they call it red pilling, or they call this kind of process of sort of emerging out of the darkness into the light as taking the red pill. And I was very interested in this way I talk about staging complexity and staging confrontations in a novel. I wanted to put an elite liberal, a writer,
Yeah.
with a certain set of quite slightly lazy views about how the world works and about what's right and what's wrong, in confrontation with this very dynamic, insurgent right wing culture that has been has emerged in the last few years. And it happened that I was invited to do a residency in Berlin, and so I spent with my family. I spent 6 months living in the western suburbs of Berlin, by the Wannsee, the lake there, which is probably best known as the site of the Wannsee Conference, which is where senior Nazi officials hashed out the details of the final solution to the Jewish question. So it has this kind of grim history that's associated with it, and a particular history obviously of European descent into fascism. And so I tell a story where my grumpy writer narrator is sort of failing to do the work that he's supposed to be doing at his residency, and he just spends his time, he wastes his time binge watching an American cop show, very violent TV show, and he begins to suspect that this show is in some way a conduit for very sort of nihilistic far right messages, and so the book takes off from there, and there's a question about how far his version of things is accurate. How reliable is he? He seems to be going through a kind of breakdown. So instead of him having the obvious sort of intellectual superiority that he thinks of himself as having in the beginning, he's genuinely challenged. He's kind of red pilled by this other worldview, or at least kind of disturbed and undermined by it. And it was a way of talking about the experience of living through the Trump era, through the rise of national populism elsewhere in the world, which obviously it's a global phenomenon. Really, there seems to be a kind of the liberal post-war liberal order, I think, has been fundamentally challenged by political forces that are not committed necessarily to democracy, and various ideas that I think certainly people of my kind of age and generation, we thought those ideas had been buried. We thought those arguments had been won. I mean, I remember the kind of my sense as I grew up from the 80s and became a young writer in the 90s was that things were going in one direction, and that was towards a kind of I suppose a multicultural, or at least a kind of a sort of broadly
yeah,
tolerant new
yeah,
world, and all that's come roaring back. I mean, I think it's been very, I mean, you remember they used to talk about the end of history,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
after the end of the Cold War and before
Fukuyama
the,
is, yeah,
yeah, before the Twin Towers came down, there
yeah,
was this period where this was this sort of technocratic idea that all that needed to be, you would just sort of tweak the levers in one, tweak the, turn the dials one way or another and just manage the world like that, and there would be no more fundamental ideological differences. Well, that sounds quaint.
yeah,
Now
yeah.
that's
So your narrator, he goes to this Debuterte Center, which is a fictional center at the once located, I guess, approximately where you were, um,
yeah,
and
I
that
stole the location of the American Academy and put another institution into the building.
exactly, exactly. So this is a center where they have this idea of openness, and openness sounds okay, but it turns out that it's a kind of oppressive openness, which is a surveillance. Uh, well, it's unclear to me whether they actually did surveillance on all the tenants there or residents, but that's what the narrator thinks, at least.
Yeah, I mean that was another part of the book. I mean, I suppose in a way the origin of the book came because I was interested in thinking about privacy and about I mean obviously privacy is something that is it seems to be changing very, very rapidly, our norms around privacy, and certainly with the internet, we are more visible to each other. Our space of privacy has been shrunk.
Yeah,
I think these days at least we exist as if at least potentially we could be being we monitored on video, and that our conversations could be overheard. And I mean, I actually just I don't think we're in a position to reverse this now, but I think we have to kind of understand the cultural implications of that, like you know, because there's something very important about being human, or something that is very fundamental, let's say, to being human, that is about having a space where you can experiment, where the things that you haven't quite worked out happen, where you assemble some version of yourself, and then you step forward into the public space and you say, this is who I am and this is how I want to present myself. And there's something very alarming about being watched or being overheard. And so, but there is this, obviously with the history of the war on terror, we're very familiar with the idea that we should give up some of our privacy in
yeah,
return for
yeah,
security. And there's that very sort of bland thing that people in these debates always say, which is, well, if you've got nothing to hide, you have
yeah,
nothing to
yeah,
fear. And I mean, I don't have anything particularly special to hide, but at the same time, I feel that I feel that I'm giving up something quite important if I allow unfettered access to my communications, or I allow myself to be watched in my private space.
yeah. So
And so
and so the narrator basically dissolves, or his sense of self is kind of dissolving, right? And at least I read that as a consequence of this surveillance, at least partly, as a consequence of this kind of ideology that of openness that was part of the Deutsche Center.
yeah, I mean, there's a little kind of there's a sort of Frankfurt School joke in there, in the idea of a political space as being this kind of civilized space of debate where everybody is transparent, and everybody kind of, the best argument kind of wins through, is a sort of set of the public sphere, you would call it, as a set of ideas associated with Jürgen Habermas, the great
Yeah,
German
yeah,
theorist, and is in a sort of ideal, I suppose, that is associated with European liberalism, and I'm interested in the ways that openness kind of can be a totalitarian
yeah,
demand. as well as it as well as a very good thing. I mean, we're just in general in culturally we're encouraged to share all the time. This is the
Yeah,
imperative we're given
yeah,
by the tech companies. This is the imperative, and we're told that it's very sort of emotionally important for us to be open and to share our feelings. And as a feeling contrarian, I kind of ask, well, why are you so keen that I share? And what is it that what if I refuse to share? What if I refuse to shape my experience in such a way that it fits an Instagram post? A nice, here's my nice, here's
yeah,
me eating my lunch and it looks so great. And you feel a little bit jealous of me, but you're happy for me that I'm having a nice lunch. And there's a kind of way in that we pre-shape our experiences to be shared now that this kind of social media culture um, does give us sort of channels through which we try and run. And I'm interested in what happens if you don't give names to things, if you allow certain parts of your life to be in darkness. What does is that altogether unhealthy? I'm not sure. I think it might be quite interesting and useful.
you also introduced the theme of German Romantic poetry. The narrator is there at the Deuter Center in order to write about the sense of the construction of self in lyric poetry, and he stumbles upon the grave of Heinrich von Kleist, who committed suicide, I guess, by the Wannsee Lake, with this woman that he shot first and then himself. And I see one of your reviewers claim that you've made a link between, an ideological link between German Romanticism and the oppressive regime of GDR and modern day Trumpism. And I couldn't really wrap my head around that. Would that be
I
an,
think if there's a line that links those three, it's quite a crooked one.
uh,
Um, but I mean, my interest in having him as this scholar of German Romanticism is to do with this the feelings that we have about our selfhood and about the kind of luxuriousness of our experience of self, which I think come from that German Romantic tradition. You know, everybody knows the sort of Caspar David Friedrich traveler over the sea of fog. He's a sort of nobleman on a mountaintop looking down over the mist, and that kind of feeling about what it is to be an individual, what it is to have a very developed sense of your experience. All these ideas that were important to Romanticism have gone forward through the culture, and I think are still very foundational for us. Um, whether I mean Trumpism and the GDR, those wouldn't be the links that I would make necessarily, but the idea of what happens when you feel that in some way you're falling short. If that's your ideal,
yeah,
to have the sense of self of a romantic poet,
yeah,
what happens when you look inside and you think, well, I don't know what I think, or I feel fragmented, or I feel kind of jumbled, and the hero of this book, the narrator of this book, um, he starts to look inside himself and wonder if there's anybody there.
yeah,
Does he have a sense of self? Is he a self at all? And that's the kind of one of the threads that, as he tugs on it, begins to unravel him completely. And of course, that gets us into ideas about the individual and the mass as well. I mean, the kind of direction of German Romanticism, one direction it takes is towards this idea of the Übermensch, the kind of superior man who stands apart from the herd, the mass, who and this kind of elitist notion of the self that has to be kind of separate from some sort of indoctrinated mass. And these days in America, it's funny that you can just go on the internet and find all sorts of people claiming that they have the truth, and that the rest of us are just sheeple. That's kind of the
yeah, yeah,
sheeple.
yeah,
I mean, and that kind. I mean, these ideas are very old ideas, and there's a particular kind of fascist formation that does make use of them. But I mean, it's not. There are other directions that German Romanticism takes through our culture that don't lead you to that place. But it's a Berlin is a really good place to set this story, just because of this history, also because of the history of the GDR and the two experiences of totalitarianism that the Germans have had.
Yeah. Did you go up to that museum in Hohenschönhausen, the Stasi prison that they have?
Yes, I did. I
It's an
did. I mean,
amazing place, right?
I mean, yeah. If you want to understand the kind of length that they went to crush the opposition, it's a very instructive place, isn't it? I mean, also another interest of mine was the fact that the German Democratic Republic used psychological techniques to, they call it Zersetzung, corrosion or undermining, to sort of destroy the personalities of the dissidents. They
Yeah, and
would
you
kind
have
of,
a story of that that's a chapter in your book, and you tell the
yes,
story of this cleaning lady whose name is Monica, and
that's
she
right.
used to be a Stasi informer.
And she was subject to some of these techniques, and she understands how, what happens when the state decides that you should have no privacy. What
Yeah,
happens when the state and what happens when the state uses techniques of modern psychology in order to almost dismantle the personal relationships and the sense of self of the opposition. And I mean, there are a lot of stories that I found out that I wasn't able to use in the novel, and it was really extraordinary, the resources that they would use to demolish the lives of the opposition. And often it would be expressed in very strange kind of petty ways, that people would break into your apartment and move your things around, or they would make sure that your package got lost at the post office. This kind of thing, this constant, everything you try to do goes wrong. And it's like being paranoid is one thing, but being paranoid, and actually there is a state agency
yeah.
that is determined in tiny ways to undermine your life.
And so this is what happens to Monica. She's alienated from all her friends in the punk scene because the Stasi has created all these situations in which she looks like an informer when really she isn't. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
And they, having kind of cut her out of from her friends, she's available to become the thing she didn't want to be. I mean, they destroy her. They completely take her life away, and she does end up working for them in this very kind of self-hating way. And then when the end of communism comes, she's almost unable to accept it. She can't quite believe that the people who've controlled her life for so long are gone.
yeah, and it's that way of, especially this one officer of the Stasi, of eating into her brain and to her consciousness and becomes a part of her. That's basically also the theme that you explore with the main character, the narrator, who meets this right-wing fellow who is actually the creator of that cop show we talked about earlier, and who is this cynic, and a right-wing cynic, and a kind of a puppet master or whatever you want to call it, and he also eats his way into his brain. Can you describe that process?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he uses the phrase, "I'm going to be living rent free in your head."
Yeah,
And that's uh Yeah, I mean, it's a chance meeting. The narrator has been spending all his time kind of hate watching this show,
yeah,
and he happens to meet the creator of the show, and the who expresses himself in this with a great deal of irony and with this kind of plausible deniability that's a real rhetorical hallmark of the online right. There's
yeah,
this kind of, just joking,
yeah,
maybe not. Kind of, there's a space that allows people to say things and to assert things and then deny them at the same time, and also then to accuse people who are saying, my God, you've just, you're a fascist or whatever, saying, what do you mean? I'm just, it's a perfectly innocent thing, and you're a bit cuckoo because you're reading things into this situation. I mean, that kind of slippery space of this ironized space, I think is really important to get to grips with now, and understanding how people communicate online, because it kind of allows things to float around without being owned. I mean, if the social consequences for asserting your love of Hitler are considerable, and so people find ways of kind of putting it into the atmosphere without necessarily standing next to it.
Yeah. And so this Anton, his real name is not Anton, but he's called Anton. I
Gary.
didn't.
Yeah.
That's
And
also
I
the
like
kind
it.
of
Like
thing
he's given himself a name that he may be his name. It's almost like that's part of his whole persona. This sort of, he's given himself the slightly sophisticated sounding Euro name, but he's he's a guy from suburban California.
Yeah, and he has all these internet nicks and pseudonyms, and he is posting a lot. So so
Hmm.
so and through this he sort of unravels this narrative, and because he is kind of he is set on figuring out what is going on, but maybe nothing much is going on. I couldn't really decide for myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was that I didn't want to tell the story of of a guy who uncovers a grand conspiracy and then either wins through or doesn't. I wanted I mean, the awfulness of this is that there is this indeterminacy to it,
Yeah,
that I mean,
exactly.
that you're not sure whether you're being paranoid, whether you're reading too much into things, or whether you're being insufficiently paranoid, and so you're left kind of stewing in your own mental juices. and
Yeah,
uh and this is kind of what happens to the narrator. He really does have a breakdown, and obviously his response to Anton is excessive and isn't factually based, but that doesn't mean there's nothing there. And it's that kind of uneasiness, I think, has underlain so much of the politics of everywhere in the last few years. I mean, the conspiracy theories have grown up on the left and on the right and the center, and
yeah,
people, and as the kind of the consensus about reality has broken down, which I think is one of the most powerful effects of social media. This kind of the ways that it kind of reinforces people's uh, particular, I don't know, you could call them interpretative communities, and separates them out from other communities, where so both two different groups of people can be equally convinced that their version of the world is the only truthful one, and that the other side are crazy. um, but there's very little. And well, this is the back to the public sphere again. If liberal democracy is going to work, you need some baseline agreement
yeah,
on what reality is. What
yeah,
what are we actually talking about here? And what's broken down in the last few years, and given this space for this quite kind of conspiratorial populism, is precisely the absence of an agreed public sphere. And there's no referee. There's no one anybody
yeah.
can turn to say, to be the arbiter of what's real and what's not. And so we're in this world of phantoms and illusions and ghosts and all these figures. I suppose they turn up in my work because they seem really the ways to understand how it feels to be alive right now.
Yeah, exactly. And so I guess this whole Anton figure is portrayed as a factor in the election of Donald Trump. That kind of internet culture that he represents was a major factor in getting Trump elected. And then there is a scene in the novel where all these liberals come together in order to celebrate Hillary Clinton's victory, of which they are all very sure when they arrive. And then gradually it collapses. And it's kind of their world is collapsing. I guess that,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe you had such a party. Just
Absolutely. It's not. It wasn't exactly the way I do it in the book. But yes, I was on election night in 2016. I was in Brooklyn with a surrounded by exactly the elite liberal kind of people
yeah,
that the Trumpers think live in Brooklyn,
yeah,
and um but also I had my phone, and on my phone I was looking at a site called 4chan, which is one of the kind of, I don't know, the cesspools of the internet
yeah,
that is, and there's a particular kind of forum on that where they've been very actively kind of promoting Donald Trump, and had become themselves involved in this very strange, complicated mysticism. There was actually a kind of sense that by posting on the internet, they felt they were bringing a reality into being,
yeah,
which is a whole other thing in itself. So on one level, I've got MSNBC or one of these news channels
yeah,
reporting the news, and my friends are fairly convinced that Clinton will win, and we'll be able to grumble about her centrist policies and blah blah blah.
yeah,
And then in the other reality, there's this kind of feverish, kind of pseudo magical kind of, we're bringing this guy into
yeah,
being. We're kind of
yeah,
they believe in like certain posts with certain numbers where it would have a particularly important effect. I mean, it's wild. But anyway, so the one reality, at one point it looked like Clinton was going to win, and they're all sad on the chans, and my friends are happy, and then it changed, and the reality of the Donald Trump presidency and quite how many things were going to get broken,
yeah,
uh, became apparent in the room, and this sort of Mask of the Red Death kind of vibe kind of
yeah,
came down
yeah,
over everybody, and it was very scary. I mean, I my wife and I weren't sure how far it was going to go, and we worry, and I think these are still open questions, but American democracy does not seem like a secure thing these
yeah,
days. It does not seem like it's universally accepted, and that was I wanted that experience of a kind of two realities clashing,
yeah,
and to have a sense of not that my friends are particularly complacent, but I wanted to have a sense of that sort of elite complacency that allowed the Trump years to happen.
yeah. Uh, and the narrator also has another enemy called Edgar, who is a more like an old-fashioned, kind of a more like an intellectual enemy who ends up writing a book on, I guess, the totalitarianism of the new left or something, that kind of thing. Can you explain the Edgar character and what is his game or his agenda?
I mean, again, there's an interest I had in kind of poking a stick at the complacency, intellectual complacency of a certain sort of, let's say, like a kind of, I don't know, a humanities trained person. Particularly a lot of people that I would meet in sort of writing circles here in
Yeah,
New York, who don't pay much attention to science, and who don't pay much attention to who have basically, who allow their priors, their notion of what ought to be, to kind of color their version of color their analysis of how things actually are. And Edgar is one of these sort of irritating hyper rationalist guys. He's a but he's a neurophilosopher, so his interest is in sort of cognitive science and the workings of the brain, and he takes it upon himself just to sort of demolish the narrator's entire intellectual project. Why would you study poetry? What is it that you mean when you even say that? Like, and he does this in this sort of smug and annoying way that leaves the narrator fuming, but also unable to formulate a coherent response.
yeah,
Um, and so, I mean, Edgar is awful in some ways. The narrator is awful, and it was kind of fun to stage this clash, because it is a clash that I do see almost like I mean, in England they used to talk about the two cultures, that didn't really talk to each other, the scientific culture and the artistic culture. and it's long been a contention of mine that to really function as an intellectual in our contemporary world, you need to know a lot about scientific and technical
Yeah.
subjects, because they're forming the reality in which we move, and it's very it's just not good enough to dismiss the techies or whatever. So I mean, it's in my a lot of my background as a journalist, when I was working as a journalist, was to be a sort of interface between those two worlds. I would be trying to kind of get the engineers to talk in a way that was intelligible to non-engineers, and also to get them to understand the concerns of non-engineers. I mean, like now there's a big conversation about artificial intelligence and ethics, and what happens when machine learning is used to deal with very, very kind of complicated social questions, like I don't know, like identifying faces in a crowd, or identifying whether some prisoner is likely to reoffend if he's been released. So there are now we're really in it. We're really in situations where you need skills from both these sides in order to make good decisions. And in a way, these two characters are kind of, each of them only have kind of one half of the equation.
I see. So we're running out of time, but I'd like to pose the question when we're talking about Edgar, because it connects with the theme of this series. Is okay. So his title is "The Totalitarianism of the New Left." Do you see? Obviously, you see a totalitarian streak in the right-wing culture that you've been describing. But what about the left? Do they? Is it something to that notion that the new left has become more totalitarian?
I mean, I'm very nervous about both siding it in a straightforward way. I mean, clearly there are elements in a kind of liberal identity politics which lead people to condemn each other, and to I don't know. To me, it seems like a sort of mutant form of American Protestantism mostly. But the way that the debate about cancel culture, as they
Yeah,
call
yeah,
it, is framed here, it's being framed in a very active and cynical way by people on the right who want to use it as a way of limiting the recent gains in terms of civil rights and cultural visibility of let's say non-white people, and
yeah.
gay people in particular. So there's a very complicated kind of conversation that makes it seem as if somehow these illiberal cancelling tendencies only stem from a kind of left-wing politics. Whereas if you actually sort of look at it, it seems that people of all kinds of political persuasions are learning to use social media outrage in order to damage their enemies and to police the space, really.
Is there
You
a
know, I mean,
way? Is there a way out of this social media outrage culture?
well, I think it's one of these things that's like it's like we hope that the virus will eventually kind of recede to being a common cold. I mean, I think as we become more sophisticated about operating in these spaces, we will know that our hair trigger outrage is maybe not the best way of doing things. But we also need to be robust in defending certain sorts of norms around free expression, but at the same time to understand that free speech has been weaponized as a weapon in the culture war, and that there's a certain set of people who are in very bad faith, claiming that they're acting on, that they care about free speech, whereas what they care about is damaging their political enemies.
Yeah. Okay, so I think unfortunately, we are out of time. Yeah. So I would like to thank you, Hari, once again for agreeing to do the interview. I very much enjoyed talking to you.
Well,
And thank you
likewise,
to
a
our
great competition. Yeah.
thank you. And thank you to our audience, both here or at home or wherever it is that you're at. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah.